This is the personalized medicine track. So we're going to go through a little bit of an introduction about what personalized medicine is, and then we're going to introduce our VIP experts. One of the reasons that genomics is becoming so capable is the cost of producing a genomic sequence has dramatically fallen. Up until about '07, it fell according to Moore's law, and more recently, it's fallen exponentially, so that now the cost of producing an individual whole sequence genome for someone is running slightly under $5,000. And with some of the advanced technology, we can produce it in a reasonable amount of time that might have some clinical significance. We can actually produce a genome well under a day. We're doing it routinely in about 4 hours, and in some cases as quick as 30 minutes. One of the things about the analytics and the compute power necessary to produce a whole genome sequence is, if you go back a few years ago, the most important part of this really was actually the sequencing itself. But going forward, the sequencing part of producing the genome is going to become rapidly commoditized. And it's the prep time that's actually going to take a fair amount of time, and the biggest amount of time is going to be the post-analytics. So we're going to talk a lot about, during this Jam Fest, about not just how we get sequencing data and the bench work it takes to get there, but actually how do I analyze the data? How do I relate it back to clinically significant opportunities? How do I curate the data? How do I document that, annotate it? And how do I look, is it useful in clinical operations, the clinical utility of the data itself? One of the reasons Intel got so involved in this is, you can see from this slide, that Intel actually contributed a lot to actually both lowering the cost of the genome sequencing and speeding up the ability for the sequence to be done in a clinically meaningful real time. By actually improving the processing, working with the people that you're going to see here from various organizations to increase the ability to do a stack of software that can analyze the genome, align it, sequence it, and make sense of it, we've actually produced a pattern that can be done in a rapid amount of time. And one of the most important steps was actually the ability to bring the analytics down to the genome and not necessarily have to move the data. But where we have to move the data using high-scale fabric and SSDs actually made a big difference in the solution speed and time. You can also see from this that we've worked with various OEMs to produce genomic appliances that help with sequencing and help with analytics. And we're actually going to talk to some of the OEM people who actually we work with to produce these appliances to make this actually real in the clinical, significant, meaningful world. You're actually going to be able to hear from the people who have helped us with the analytics stack, who have helped us with the appliances, and also, how do you make this relevant to individuals? Why should an individual care about this? This slide actually shows that I have a fair number of tests that I can do, but I actually only have a small number of meaningful clinical genes that I know what they do now that are going to be relevant to your life. This is going to actually expand going forward greatly. I've got about 3,000 tests, but I've got about 500 so meaningful clinical interactions that I can do today. And we're going to hear from people who are going to talk about meaningful clinical interactions and what that actually means in the real world. You can actually see this really is a big data problem. What this slide is showing you is the amount of storage that's going to be needed to actually take this solution and put it into real time in real space. We're talking about exabytes here of storage. What if we sequenced everybody in the United States, 300 exabytes? What if we sequenced every cancer patient twice a week? We're talking about something approaching 500 exabytes of data. It's not just about, again, the compute power here. It's not just about even the wet bench research. It's how do I take, as a doctor, the description that I offer of who you are. I don't describe you by your genes. As a clinician, I describe you as a 40-year-old white male with lung cancer. And then I describe the pathology of the lung cancer. So how do I take that phenotypic description and link it to the genotypic data and then produce a meaningful outcome to you, also based on your environment? We know your environment has a lot to do with this. The drugs that you're on have a lot to do with it, whether you're a smoker and what your family history is and what your ancestry. So all of this coming together to produce a meaningful recommendation at an individual basis for therapy for your tumor. Now that I've had my little brief introduction, let me introduce you to the panel of experts that we're going to go to. Panel, why don't you introduce yourselves briefly, give your name, rank, and serial number.
This is Stephen Schwartz. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Business Development at 23andMe. I was in the clinical lab industry for 10 years and then the electronic medical records industry before joining the personalized medicine space with 23andMe.
Hi, Mark. This is Andy Litt. I'm the former Chief Medical Officer at Dell Healthcare. I'm a neuroradiologist by training and ran a hospital for a while, and have been working with Dell for a few years now. I've recently left Dell to pursue an investment opportunity.
This is Mauricio Carnero. I lead the technology development group here at the Broad Institute. Our group is responsible for a lot of the tools that are used worldwide. We've been deeply thinking about all these questions, and we try to answer them with tools that will enable science for everyone else to do.
So guys, why don't we kind of go starting maybe with you first, Mauricio, and tell us, can you summarize your interest in genomics and what your organization is actually doing?
The organization, the Broad Institute, was founded to create a center for collaboration across all of the big institutes and hospitals, especially here in Massachusetts, but also across the globe, to pursue the very difficult tasks of answering the research questions of complex diseases. So we are talking diabetes, autism, schizophrenia, all the really difficult diseases that we know have some genetic component associated with it, but they have been far too difficult for any professor or lab on their own to make big strides in research.
Andrew, as the former partner here with Dell, could you tell us a little bit about what Dell's interest is in this, and maybe comment a little bit on the appliance that we just noted that you guys produced?
Yeah, sure, Mark. I'd be happy to talk about that. So Dell, working with Intel, partnered with the Translational Genomics Institute in Phoenix to sponsor the first FDA clinical trial in personalized medicine, which involved a rare cancer called neuroblastoma, which affects children. And what Dell's real interest in this was to bring high-performance computing technology as well as cloud-based storage technology to bear in this big data problem, as you mentioned. You know, when we went into the TGen, that's the organization, the Translational Genomics Institute, it was taking them a week of compute time after the sequence was done. After that $1,000 operation that you talked about in your introduction, then there was a week of compute time to do the analysis. And by putting some high-performance computing in that was optimized for the appropriate algorithms that Mauricio was just talking about, then we were able to turn that down to about 4 hours. So that's a pretty significant point, as you mentioned, wanting to get your clinical information quickly and not wait a week for that to happen. And then we kind of ran across the problem of what do you do with all that data, and how do you make it usable for people? How do you store it? So we took some cloud technology that we already have in the healthcare arena, which is HIPAA protected and secure, things that are pretty important when it comes to healthcare, and made it available for genomics to build a genomics cloud. And more importantly, build specialized portals into the data, a research access portal, a clinician access portal, a patient access portal, so that people could get access to the data that they needed for the part of the operation that they were concerned about. So our interest is really to support the infrastructure around that, and I think it's been a pretty exciting ride.
Fantastic. It sounds like Dell is moving forward with this very seriously. Has the appliance kind of taken off? Are you seeing sales of this? Are people asking for this capability?
I have to tell you, there's nobody who's not talking about doing massive amounts of genomic sequencing over the next few years, and everybody is trying to figure out, one, how to do it faster, and two, what do you do with the data once you've done it. So there have been quite a few sales of the high-performance computing solution.
Thank you very much, Andy. Steve, 23andMe, an amazing company. You chose well getting involved, sir. Could you tell us a little bit about what 23andMe is up to?
My interest in genetics actually started at a pretty young age. I had two first cousins who died of a condition called long QT syndrome when I was in my mid-20s, and then later found that I had the same condition. So I became aware of genetics early on, and while I spent time in the clinical lab industry and electronic medical records industry, it had always interested me, how do we put the knowledge of genetics to work to help people live, longer, healthier lives. And 23andMe came into being in about 2006 with the, with the vision of doing two things. One, to make genetics and make genetic testing understandable, interesting, and affordable for the masses, so that anyone on the planet that's interested in learning about all those things that are becoming discovered about how genetics relates to your health can learn about themselves in new ways, and at the same time learn interesting things like about your ancestry and what traits you're going to pass down to your children. And it gives you an opportunity to leverage the partnership between consumers and institutions to do research on a scale that couldn't have been imagined previously. We have 650,000 people now who have been genotyped. All that can be correlated and researched to do things like find new associations. Since the first genome was sequenced, only about 12 years ago, there have been thousands of discoveries about how healthcare is impacted by your genes.
You're reaching out to the consumer world. Are you seeing an increased demand? Does the average consumer really care about their genomic profile?
There's definitely been a tremendous uptick in interest in the past 18 months or so. The company in the first 4 years genotyped roughly 100,000 individuals. And then just in the past, 12 to 18 months, we've now done another 500,000 individuals. What 23andMe has done is to try to focus on just that subset of the genome, which we know is associated with many diseases, and to teach and to make it easy for the typical consumer to see how their genome compares to genomes that are impacted by different diseases, and then be able to help understand risks associated with that.
Mauricio, at your level, at the broad research level, are you seeing an increased demand by organizations to stand up this capability? Is it just in the U.S., or are you seeing it more nationally or internationally?
It is really everywhere. I mean, that I know of initiatives in all the continents. I can tell you that there's a very beautiful initiative with a huge investment from the World Bank in Nigeria and Africa.
I know we're hearing about projects out of the Middle East where specific countries want to sequence their whole population, the 100 Genome Project from the UK, just on and on. So it does seem like the work you're doing is benefiting people internationally. Andrew, as the clinician, as the chief medical officer, are you seeing these breakthroughs move into clinical care in any meaningful manner, or is this still just really like Mauricio doing research?
People sort of throw out that word genomics and they kind of lump a lot of different things together, and it's important to separate it into the different types, whether that's just looking at small sequences or looking at larger areas or looking at the whole genome. And each of them has a role. It's not that one is better than the other, it's just that they're different. The biggest impact today is in using genomics to help define different populations who might be a candidate for a certain therapy, particularly in cancer. So, for example, the classic one that most people know is the BRCA gene in breast cancer, which may or may not make a woman more susceptible, but also more susceptible to certain therapies later. The next real interest is around this idea of tailoring therapy on a very personal level to the tumor itself. And you mentioned earlier the idea that, we classify the patient as a 40-year-old, African-American male or whatever, and then we classify the disease. And historically, we've classified diseases by, where did the tumor come from? It's lung cancer. And what kind of cell does it look like under the microscope? Oh, it's a squamous cell carcinoma, right, which means a flat, elongated cell, right? That's a pretty broad classification, and we're beginning to find out that maybe that's not such a great classification. Maybe we need to think about the genomics of each tumor and see how different tumors, even though they might come from different parts of the body, might be alike because they have the same mutations and therefore may be susceptible to the same therapies, which could be a big improvement over where we are today historically with cancer.
I might add, the area of pharmacogenomics is getting a fair amount of attention. There are a number of drugs that, based on your genomics, are individuals are either more sensitive to or less sensitive to. It can create risks when somebody goes into the hospital to go under anesthesia, or potentially related to certain drugs that they're given that may create coagulation issues. And you're seeing companies pop up that are specializing in offering testing directly to physician practices to enable them to use that as they tailor a drug regimen for a patient.
It's Andy. I just wanted to add to Steve's point because he's exactly right, and I think that pharmacogenomics area is really important, and particularly as we start to see the cost of some of the newer pharmaceutical therapies, in the tens or sometimes even $100,000 a year. It's really important if the pharmaceutical company can raise the percentage of patients for which that therapy will be effective, so they can sort of separate out the patients who has a chance of working on and the ones who it really doesn't have a chance. That helps them justify that high cost for those different therapies.
Are we seeing anything around metabolic diseases? I mean, as a family doctor, I used to stab the little baby's heels and use filter paper back in the old days to try to detect metabolic disease. This would seem like a great way to screen a population for metabolic illness.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the most of those metabolic illnesses, as you know, have some genetic component to them, and therefore they can be screened for rather, and many can be screened for prenatally at this point. Just look at the recent announcement for the genomic-based test for HPV to replace the Pap smear. Right, this is actually looking for the genomics of that specific virus, which we know is what causes cervical cancer, and increases the risk of a woman having cervical cancer, and it's a heck of a lot easier test to do than a Pap smear test.
What are the issues or concerns you think that are arriving around privacy? Mauricio, from a research perspective, how do you guys approach privacy, and security of this massive amount of data which, people are offering and giving you?
There is no easy answer, but it's one that we and everyone else is thinking about right now, and how can we actually guarantee the security and the safety of all this data. I could tell you that, we encrypt our data at rest, we put it under, I don't know how many keys and etc., but the truth is that to make this data actually useful and to make actual discoveries, we do need to shuffle and go through all of this data, and it is a very hard task to do so in a secure fashion.
I would guess that over the course of the next few years, this industry will develop a strict set of standards that closely parallels how HIPAA treats health information, and genetic information will need to be treated with the same level of privacy and security. We certainly do that at 23andMe. We have a direct relationship with consumers, and so we take that very, very seriously.
Let me just weigh in on that one, which is that I think the issue is the flip side of privacy is security and making sure that the data is kept secure. And I agree with what Steve and Mauricio said. The thing, though, is when you start to think about full genomic sequencing, and you think about anonymizing the data or making it, in some way less identifiable, there is no real anonymizing genomic data. Nobody has your genome but you and your identical twin if you have one. So that makes it a lot more difficult. And my provocative statement is that I think the data is going to be a heck of a lot safer in the cloud providers who are really built to manage large amounts of data in a very high secure environment, because that's how many of these providers, including Dell, were set up.
So how do I kind of reconcile this with the pundits telling me that security is the big bugaboo out there, and unless we can guarantee anonymity, security, no one ever is going to be malicious with this data, it kind of almost puts at an institutional level a chilling effect on this. I mean, again, Mauricio, you probably see this in the research environment, lots of regulations. Steve, I know you're getting this at the consumer level. You're being questioned about what are you doing with this data, what advice are you offering, and Andy, as a clinician, I mean, what do you tell patients here?
As a doc, my experience and working with the clinical trial that we've been involved in with these children with pediatric cancer is parents particularly are very interested in the security of their children's data until they get cancer. And then all of a sudden they basically say, we don't care. What we want to do is find a cure for my kid, right? That's what's really important. And if I have to sacrifice a little bit of privacy or a little security in that, I will.
The fear is founded, and it's understandable that people will be a little hesitant to sequence, given that the security is not guaranteed. But at the same time, no other thing can give you 100% security on anything. And at this point in time, really, somebody stealing your genome doesn't mean much for now until we know more about what to do with it. So there's no, I don't know of any hacker out there that's trying to steal genomes out of databases in the world. What we really face in the research world is it's both a problem of lack of regulation and over-regulation. So there's lack of regulation from the government side to protect people who donate or who give their genomes for research, to allow this genomes to be shared and analyzed in different disease projects, in different research projects, in a safe and consented way. It's very hard today, if I wanted to go around and ask different projects to share their samples so that I can combine, for example, the cancer patients with the diabetes patients, so I can try to draw any better conclusions about my autism research. There is no mechanism to do that follows any regulations put down by any government organization. At the same time, there's a lot of regulation that impedes this collaboration to happen. A lot of it because there is no other regulation to tell us how to do it.
I think it's important to keep in perspective, though, the level of security we do have, whether it's, for a large database or something, simpler. The security being used to protect health information and genomic information is the same level of security, that you use when you go to your bank. The level of security, that most institutions are providing for this information is very high, and that shouldn't be, I think, that high of a consideration for an individual.
If a patient showed up with all the genomic data that Steve could produce or Mauricio could produce from research or from the 23andMe panel and handed it to their doctor, it strikes me as most doctors wouldn't have a clue what to do with it. How are we going to get the doctors up to speed to do meaningful things, and how are we going to get the doctors to the point where they realize genomics is just as important as patient history to what they're doing with patients?
I would say that it's going to be a slow process. Unfortunately, it takes a long time to diffuse new medical knowledge and new technology out there. Often it's the patients coming in and asking the tough questions that forces the doctor to go home and do some reading at night and try to figure it out. There's still the issue that most of this isn't paid for by insurance. So that's a problem in and of itself, right? Because how does the patient get the insurance coverage? How do they get it paid for, et cetera? Does the doctor feel like he can order it if it's going to cost the patient X dollars? That sort of thing. So these are things that are going to get worked out.
What you're beginning to see happening is the adoption of those kind of genetic tests where there is strong, clear clinical utility become the health panels of the future. When a physician, in the future will want to assess your overall health and where they ought to focus with you on areas of prevention and in their health planning with you. In the future, there will be a panel of tests, probably one that looks very different than the ones we offer today, but there will be a series of panels that clinicians will use as probably something early in life to help screen all those childhood things that someone might be susceptible for, and then later in life, something to kind of reassess where either things have changed or as individuals become, focused on different types of conditions that they're susceptible to. There may be another kind of screening, process for that. And the insurance industry is certainly looking at how they're going to do this. They're certainly not covering much today. They are covering, pharmacogenetic testing for the most part, and very targeted genetic testing, but they're looking at the efficacy and the health economics of how genetic testing will help clinicians, and it will evolve over the next 5 or 10 years.
Andrew, I hope it doesn't take 17 years for this to refuse to the average doctor. Steve, I'd love to see this become as prevalent as the SMAC24 profiles that I remember from the 90s. That would be fantastic. Well, I want to thank you guys very much for a lively hour here, a lively discussion. Please come to the Hangouts. Please come and join the discussions for us going forward. We look for a lively interaction, and we look for your input. Thank you all very much.